You're listening to The Weather Junkies.
Oh boy. Large wedge tornado coming up into Tuscaloosa. A winter storm warning is in effect for our area.
This snow we can expect at least another 2 to 4 inches for tonight. Then that snow.
The National Weather Service in Huntsville has issued a tornado warning for northwestern Massachusetts.
14 to 22 inches of snow!
Good Thursday evening. I'm meteorologist Tyler Jankowski, joining the show live from Connecticut. And so often during our shows, we would start off by saying, well, there's not a whole lot going on. But this night is a totally different situation. It's not a snowstorm, but we have a tropical threat on the East Coast. And within a few hours, the first hurricane to hit Florida in more than a decade will make landfall, and that is Hurricane Hermine. With that intro, Dakota is joining us live from Colorado. Dakota.
Hey, everyone. Hey, Tyler. I'm actually in Fort Collins, Colorado tonight, and yeah, I don't really want to talk about the weather in my backyard because there's a lot of weather, as you alluded to, down along the Gulf Coast and the Florida Panhandle. But a quick synopsis: really nice day. Wasn't very hot, cloudy, partly cloudy today. Really enjoyed it. But yeah, I would like to get to talking about Hermine. How's the weather on the East Coast?
It's fine right now, and it'll be fine through Saturday. It'll be a gorgeous start to the Labor Day weekend, but then things go downhill on Sunday and Monday. We're not locked in completely to all the impacts, but we have a pretty good feel for the storm, and that is it doesn't make a direct hit, but we have fringe impacts on the periphery of the storm. So not terrible, but it doesn't look beautiful on Sunday or Monday. So that's what we're looking at right now. It looks like New Jersey could get hammered, though.
Yeah, models are slowly but surely coming to a solution for that. I was told, by the way, that you can get the weather in our backyards if you go on Google. Did you know about this?
No, you mean like just the weather forecast?
You can Google your weather forecast. Yes.
Oh, there's nothing like a personal story, though.
I know. I'm with you, Tyler. Anyways, let's get into our tweets of the week here, and they're all pretty much going to relate to Hermine here. So this is a tweet from Ryan Maui, a very, very popular Twitter account. Tweets a lot of good weather graphics. He works for Weatherbell. You can follow him at Ryan Maui, and it says 2 7-day weather models: European versus American, major Gulf, hurricane versus nothing. So the European had a major Gulf Coast hurricane, and then the GFS had nothing in the Gulf, essentially. And a lot of people are looking at this like, oh, Euro had it all the way, but it also had a lot wrong. I mean, it has it as a major hurricane. It also had it, I think, a bit too fast. I think a day maybe fast.
Yeah, the Euro has definitely not had its best performance on this storm. Sometimes it really depends where you are to get a sense for how it's performed. And obviously, being in Connecticut, the northwestward progress of the storm was very important to us. And we really noticed that the Euro flip-flopped by 100, 200 miles over the last couple of days. So it really hasn't been the consistent, locked-in solution that you so often see from the mighty Euro. I think the GFS has performed pretty well. I mean, I believe it was the GFS that first showed the idea of something to the northwest as opposed to way out to sea. And initially, a lot of people probably thought, wow, come on, GFS, you're embarrassing yourself. But seems like it's going to be somewhere closer to that as opposed to a complete miss.
Yeah, I think the bottom line here, all models kind of struggled in the beginning figuring out what this storm was going to do, if it was ever going to become Hermine or get named. And obviously it has, and now it's become a quite the hurricane. You have a tweet, Tyler, to share?
I do. I'm actually having trouble locating our document. Can you send me that link and then we can continue on with our tweets? We usually have a fancy rundown here with our tweets of the week, and Dakota's working on sending me that link, so we'll load it up here.
Okay, yeah,
Oh.
I'll do another one real quick here. Let's see. I had some good ones. This one is actually from our guest tonight, and it's a pretty remarkable stat here from Dr. Philip Klotzbach. You can follow him at Phil Klotzbach, and his tweet says, "It has been 3,965 days since the last hurricane made landfall in Florida, and that was Wilma on October 24th, 2005, and that's going to change in an hour or so, I think, maybe a little longer than that. So, Hermine is, poses a lot of threat to damage, to property and human life along the Gulf and potentially along the East Coast. But it's also breaking this kind of weird record of 11 years without or 10 and a half, I guess, years without a hurricane hitting Florida, which is remarkable considering the orientation of Florida.
Our next tweet comes from Mac Morris. His Twitter handle is @KBTXMac, and it's a satellite animation over the last couple of hours. His tweet says, "Good grief, Hermine gets her act together in a hurry. Eyewall developed in a matter of hours." And that's exactly what's happened here over the last 3, 4, 5 hours, where the storm has really developed an eye. There were a lot of cold cloud tops this morning, then they diminished, but boy, the storm has really came back and got its act together. So I did see a mention that could perhaps aggravate the storm surge and wind concerns in the Big Bend area of Florida.
Yeah, so I guess I'm looking at the radar here, and hasn't made landfall yet, but in due time, and hopefully people out there have taken their precautions already. You never want to see people in areas of storm surge and then they not leave. I know there were some mandatory evacuations for a few counties, and then some voluntary evacuations.
Looking at the satellite picture, I'd be interested to know if the shape of the land there enhances the amount of storm surge, because if you look at a map, the Big Bend area of Florida is basically a notch. So you have Panama City, PCB, for those spring break goers, to the west, and then obviously the main Florida peninsula. But in the middle, you have that little notch, and that's exactly where the northeast quadrant of the storm is headed. And the northeast quadrant has the strongest winds, and the wind will push the water. So I'm wondering if that'll help make the storm surge worse.
Yeah, I'm sure it does. The National the National Hurricane Center has some really good storm surge. They're all experimental products. They're not operational per se at the moment, but it looks like the worst of it and is going to be kind of, let's see, there's no cities on here, but it's like the coastline southeast of Tallahassee. I think that's what you're referring to, that notch.
Yeah, does it give feet on there?
Yeah, it has greater than 9 feet potential.
Oh wow, I do see the graphic now. That red area.
And that's a 10%, greater than 10% chance of being exceeded.
Is that all of those colors are on land, right?
Yeah. You can turn the intertidal layer on and off, which means that you're getting rid of like the beach or areas that are not always underwater based on the tides. And so yeah, when you get rid of that layer and you have just the red, you have gray, red, orange, yellow, blue, and then the gray is the intertidal zone, and then the red, all the other colors are actual land that's going to be inundated.
9 feet's a lot.
Yeah. I think right along the coast, probably on beach areas that don't get inundated during the tides, or could see up
It'll
to
be
9 feet, and then
interesting to see if they issue this product for New Jersey and in surrounding areas as we head into Sunday and Monday.
oh yeah, I'm sure they will. They already have. You can already see some of it along like the eastern
Carolinas?
coast of yeah, and like the very it's so far out that the chances aren't very high yet. But if you look in some of the like the rivers, the tidal rivers, you can see some like 3 feet, 5 foot, 1 to 3 feet feet inundation. So yeah, the products are awesome. If you want to take a look at them, just go to the National Hurricane Center at www.nhc.noaa.gov, and you'll find a slew of products there that are really awesome. These storm surge maps are being widely shared as they're new and fun to look at. Those are all my tweets that I wanted to share, Tyler. But I wanted to, before we talk with Dr. Klotzbach, I want to talk about one thing, and that's like the terrible coverage that 99L and the tropical storm activity was getting before it even became anything. And I don't know if you know what I'm talking about, but there were like a slew of tweets and articles that were dead wrong about what was going on. Like some of them said Florida was on a hurricane watch, and there was no hurricane watch at the time, and then some were saying, I don't know, it was ridiculous. Did you see any of that?
I did. I was I believe I was enjoying my time at the World Series when that happened. I glanced at Twitter and was like, oh my gosh, I'm glad I'm not like intertwined like I normally am. But I guess numerous accounts. So it was like Nightly News and the Daily Mail over in the UK and probably USA Today. At least one point they tweeted something that was wrong. But when you think about it, this is probably the first real threat of a hurricane hitting the U.S. in the social media era, right? I mean, 11 years ago, we didn't have social media, and I don't think there's been a threat like this in the last, well, for Florida, I should say. For Florida, I don't know if that stat holds for other areas because I can't remember off the top of my head. But
well, I guess if you don't include Sandy or
yeah, Sandy, well, in the science books was not a hurricane when it hit, right? Atlantic City, at least.
Yeah.
The other thing that really bothered me was when I saw tweets that said hurricane bears down as Zika concerns go up. I'm like, what? How many like clickbait things can you combine in one tweet? I mean, maybe rain enhances Zika. I don't know, but you don't have to put it in the same tweet.
Yeah, I saw that.
And, there could be a big threat, whatever, but we can't keep scaring people every time there's a threat of something. I mean, it's every time. These people that compose tweets try to brew up the worst possible situation, the most possible death and destruction. It's terrible.
Yeah, so that was like kind of it hit a nerve this week with all the bad coverage, and at least now that Hermine is in full swing here, I think the coverage has gotten a lot better, and it seems like when there's not something going on, but there could be, people try to make this hype and this fear that doesn't actually exist.
I think as certified meteorologists, we look at the situation and say, whoa, 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 hold your horses. There is going to be plenty of times when we can send out a tweet that realistically is scary. There's going to be plenty of times when that's a real threat. And it may be 1 week from now. You're not going to have to wait a year. So just calm down. We'll cover the storm ethically and accurately and realistically. And when we have to put the tweet out that a hurricane is going to hit, we will. There's no need to jazz it up 7 days out because we can't be patient. I think as meteorologists, we understand that there are plenty of times when the situation is grave enough for a tweet that may be jolting. You don't have to do it every week. I think people that just do social media don't quite understand that. And even if that wasn't the case, it still doesn't give you a right to tweet whatever you want. And we have a very special guest tonight as we watch the first hurricane hit Florida in more than a decade. The guest tonight is from Colorado State University, and his name is Dr. Phil Klotzbach. And you may think the name is familiar, and that is correct because he issues the renowned seasonal hurricane forecasts each off season when we're anticipating what's to come in the next hurricane season. So he works on the hurricanes. He has a PhD, and no one better to come on and talk about the tropics and Hermine than Dr. Philip Klotzbach tonight. So we are going to play a pre-recorded interview with him now here on the Weather Junkies.
And now we're joined by Dr. Philip Klotzbach of Colorado State University. He's a research scientist here. And I want to get right into it. Right now we have a tropical storm in Hermine. This is pre-recorded Eastern time. So if you're listening right now on the East Coast at night, a tropical storm, not a hurricane yet, and we don't know if it's going to be. Looks like it will be, but we're not sure. So I want to get right in with you. What are some of the biggest impacts you see this making in the Florida coast and then inland?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously there's some potential surge impacts that could be pretty significant. The Hurricane Center has developed all these really cool storm surge products over the last couple of years, and this is one of the first chances they've been able to run this stuff live. And there could be some potential significant surges, even though this won't be a particularly, at most, probably the highest it'll be is maybe a Category 1 as it approaches, or as it makes landfall, which while having some wind damage, the surge damage could be pretty significant. And then there's a lot of uncertainty in its future track. Some models take it pretty close to the coast, potentially bringing a lot of flooding and wind damage, maybe up to mid-Atlantic states.
After it goes through Florida.
After it goes through Florida. Others take it more offshore, and just looking at the latest model runs even a few minutes ago, everything's kind of, there's a lot of uncertainty, and this storm has been incredibly unpredictable since it got started. I mean, it was Invest 99L about 2 weeks ago, and it just like this inexorably slow progression to finally becoming a tropical storm. It just took a really long time. I know, I'm sure there's a lot of people at the Hurricane Center that are ready to be done with this silly storm, but I don't think it's going anywhere, unfortunately, anytime real soon. So I think we'll be dealing with Hermine probably for at least the next 5 days, maybe even longer, depending on how it interacts with frontal zone and some other stuff coming down the pike.
So because it's at most it'll probably be a Cat 1 before landfall in Florida. We're looking at surge and inland flooding, probably the top two. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and it's been interesting because people want to know when's the last storm, and so Florida hasn't had a hurricane in 10 years. So it's been running a great string of luck. That's twice the longest period they'd ever had. So that streak potentially may end tonight, but maybe it won't get up to 65 knots, and that streak will continue off to sea. But there's a lot of people that have been kind of counting the streak because it has been remarkably long, and
and it sticks out in between the Gulf and an ocean. So you'd assume that. Yeah,
exactly. But the Big Bend area itself hasn't been hit by. The last hurricane to hit within about 100 miles of where the storm's probably going to make landfall was Hurricane Earl back in 1998, which was, it might be one of the ugliest looking hurricanes on record. It was incredibly strongly sheared, but it was a Category 2. It just, all the convection was on the east side. So if you want to look and see ugly Hurricane Earl.
Yeah, I'm scrolling through your tweets right now.
Fits the bill.
The visible of Hurricane Earl.
Yeah. Not a particularly attractive one.
Yeah. And it looks like you also put up some tracks of recent Panhandle.
Yeah, so I did is I pulled down, there's been 9 hurricanes that hit within about 150 miles of where Hermine is likely to make landfall since 1950. And so there's a couple of pretty significant ones. Eloise was a pretty significant storm in 1975. Easy was a major hurricane, but it made landfall quite a bit further south. But there hasn't been a lot of activity on the Big Bend since 1950. There were quite a few more actually back even in the late 19th century up in that area. So for one reason or another, the Big Bend itself of the hurricanes haven't really gone up in there as much super recently.
Interesting. So after this makes landfall, and you alluded to it, it kind of trying to figure it out after it goes into the it might stay on land, might stay just nudge right along the coast. What do you think right now? Kind of processing all that model data.
Yeah, I mean it's hard. I mean the European model tends to kind of, but the European models really love this storm since it got started and keeps wanting to make this thing a monster and just kind of have this monster storm sitting there. So it's the latest run. It should be updated soon. Had it kind of sitting off the East Coast for a while. And I read the discussion from the Weather Service because I grew up in Massachusetts and my family still lives on the coast. Interested in this storm. And so the Weather Service, I think, did a good job, at least up in New England. They said probably the worst impacts, potentially 40, 50 mile an hour winds, 2 to 4 inches of rain, which for them, compared with like a good nor'easter or whatever, isn't super huge. But obviously if the storm stays around, we're talking some potential coastal erosion. And if the storm takes a more inland track, you could see a lot of flooding in the mid-Atlantic states. So there's a lot of uncertainty. And, I think that's the thing with this storm. If it's anything, has taught us that, there's just a lot of uncertainty. Some storms are nice, predictable things, and some storms just aren't. This has been one of the much more challenging storms, I think, that they've had to deal with down at the Hurricane Center for a while, because it just hasn't really gotten going. I mean, it just took till about yesterday to really start ramping up. It's been a really very slow developing system.
Yeah, it seems like the models have always had the potential for it to become something that could have a real impact, and then it just kind of never was going in that direction. But so meteorologists wanted to talk about it because it was on some of the model long range, even medium range. So this actually brings me to a question that Tyler had. He's our co-host.
Okay.
He said, how can humans be better than the models if we change with every model suite? So I guess he's asking, like, how do meteorologists add to the kind of post-model processing?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of it is, frankly, a lot of it with meteorologists is communication. I mean, you have to be able to communicate, because you can give people a bunch of models and say, here's what the models are saying. You have to realize which models have done well with a particular storm. Some models don't do well with certain types of storms. Some models have bad streaks where they just don't do well for a while. I mean, the European model in general is, the model everyone wants to use, and it had at one point had a major, like a Cat 4 barreling into Texas, and that was 5 days out, which you would think with the European model not too bad. But when you're having developing systems and when it doesn't have a closed circulation, the models don't do very well with those, and especially where that system, when the models are really trying to ramp it up, as when it was just north of Hispaniola. And if you were watching the satellite, you could see these little like low-level vorticity centers that would kind of spin up and then just drift west, and they just there was never really any organized. It was a big, massive thunderstorms, but it never really got organized. And I think a lot of it, some of it was probably terrain driven too. You got downsloping off the terrain, the higher terrain. So it's a tough process. And I mean, even obviously with brilliant modelers running all these models, it's, models are great tools, but it's important that, meteorologists, I think in general, did a reasonably good job of, saying, hey, these models are saying this, but don't. I mean, if you look at the European model, I think it had 4 runs where it had like a major hurricane in Apalachicola, and then it was in like Mobile, and then it went to Texas, and then it went to Louisiana. And I mean, you just can't, the model's jumping all over the place, and it has a 500, 700 mile track swing in one run. You realize there's just a lot of uncertainty in these things. And I think that's really what meteorologists can add, is that obviously it's interpretation of the data, and also looking at things like how well does the model even initialize, because sometimes the models don't initialize the circulation very well, and that can also pose problematic when you're looking at if it doesn't get the initial conditions right, it's going to blow up when it tries to run it forward. So in general, the models do a reasonably good job, but they do a better job of track than do with Genesis. Once predicting a storm TC Genesis is a really hard problem, and we see this even with the current invest that like 3 or 4 days ago, all the models had this monster storm coming off Africa, a really good wave, and it's just every run it gets weaker and weaker, and now very few models even have it in it. So I think that's one of the takeaway points I always use with tropical cyclones, that Genesis is a really hard process to forecast, and I think we still honestly don't even know exactly what causes storms to form. I mean, there's a lot of different theories, and I think it's probably a combination of all of them, and some storms may be more bottom up or top down, depending on which I think there's just a lot of ways to Genesis, and the models just can't quite handle them all yet.
That's a big research question, I
Yeah.
assume. In the tropical community.
Yeah, and I mean, I was reading a paper on it the other day, and they're basically like, well, it looks like this part was, from basically like, they call them like hot towers, but basically deep thunderstorms that effectively they kind of get a few of them, they come together and kind of spin it up, and others say it's mid-level circulations that go down, and maybe some it's one way than the other. I don't think every storm certainly doesn't form the same way. So it's definitely a big process, or a process that's being researched very intensively. And I think obviously when you have a storm like 99L, which is now Hermine, it means that there's still more work that needs to be done on that process.
Yeah. So my takeaways from that is experience, with looking at models over a kind of a regular pattern, kind of getting a feel for what it does better, what it does worse. And then the second part was kind of looking at the real-time data and comparing that with the initialization, or maybe like a few hours out, and making sure that it's not lost already.
Yeah, you have to look and see, because you can just see with models, like there'll be a model that just really wants to develop a system, and if it just keeps developing a storm, it doesn't go, sometimes models will just try to kill it. They just hate it and they'll just keep killing it, even if it's still there. And you have to look at that kind of stuff too. So, I mean, the Hurricane Center, obviously their track forecasts have improved quite a bit. And a lot of that's obviously the guidance they're getting is better, but obviously they do add additional value to it as well. And they can usually show that their track forecasts even improve upon most of the consensus models by a little bit, because they can add some additional value, obviously beyond the fact that they write the discussions and explain all the meteorology that goes behind it. But obviously with a storm like this, it's been a tough job for those guys down there.
Yeah. So kind of a non-meteorology question here, more of a communication question. So how do you feel about the build-up to these types of systems? Because I feel like I saw a few images on social media and even in some articles that showed, like, I don't know, a major hurricane in the Gulf, and they were just pulling from whatever model was blowing it up at that point. Well, I don't know how strong of or not strong of opinion you have on this, so I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I try to post stuff, I try to put stuff in perspective. Like, I'm not saying that yes, Hermine will be a hurricane that makes landfall, but I say, hey, the last hurricane that made landfall here was blah. People are curious. If it's a tropical storm, then once that makes landfall, I'll say this is the strongest storm since XYZ that made landfall in Florida, or whatever. But I think I try not to post like, here's what XYZ model said at this run, if it's the only one saying it and nothing else is saying it, because I didn't post any of the European models that were blowing up these massive storms. After they had like 4 or 5 runs of it, I said, see how consistently it's been weakening over time. But I try, I think you got to be careful not to like freak people out. I generally try to be very, not to say a whole lot more, especially with like intensity or track beyond what the Hurricane Center says. You don't want to, mix the messages. And what I try to provide like on my stuff is just basically like trivia kind of stuff that the Hurricane Center people probably know, but aren't necessarily, I dig through all the data and call out these random statistics, but I don't really try. Other than that, I don't really do that much in terms of like making my own forecasts. Obviously I have my own ideas, but I don't put that out for the general public. I figure let the guys that get paid to do that job. They have a harder job than what I have to do. So. Well,
your posts get a lot of action, I must say. Consistently, it seems like you're getting like, I don't know, 50 retweets, maybe 100 retweets, and
it depends on what it is. Some things a lot more than others, but it just there's a lot. When a storm comes, there's a lot of people that are just interested to kind of see what how things compare, and when was the last storm that did this, and try to be try to provide that kind of information. So
I really like it. So thank you.
Sure.
So I wanted to talk about a little more about your work. I was perusing your website here, and so the first thing you all do, this is the Tropical Meteorology Project. That's the title of your work, and the first thing you guys do is you make the seasonal forecast.
Yeah, and that's kind of like the thing that Dr. Guay started these back in the 1980s, and we've been doing them every year since. And it's kind of what I guess the project originally was known for. Dr. Guay had studied tropical cyclones for 30 years before I started doing the seasonal forecast. He spent a lot of time doing tropical cyclone structure, intensity change. He did a lot of studies on just like clouds, cumulative convection, and all this stuff. So he'd studied a ton of things, but he noted that when you had El Niños, you had fewer hurricanes in the Atlantic. And so he spent a little bit of time researching all that kind of stuff. And then he started putting out these seasonal forecasts. So on our website, we have every forecast back to 1984. So if you're curious, and we have all the numbers archived too. So because some great of the year's not so well, and I think it's important to just be honest and say, here's how we did. And every year at the end of the year, we do a verification. So we go back and say, okay, here's why we predicted what we did, or here's what we thought at the time. Here's how it panned out. Did it pan out well? Did it not? And our forecasts also don't just have numbers. We put a lot of time and effort into writing up kind of what the current situation is, and I think that's useful at the end of the season. So I try to figure out like, what the heck was I thinking? Why did I forecast 4 hurricanes when there were 12, or vice versa? But in general, the forecasts show, I'd say the April forecasts have the least skill because you're still a long way out from the peak of the season, which starts early August. And then as you get closer, your forecasts show more and more skill, especially the early August forecast shows pretty good skill.
Yeah, I like that you guys do updates to the seasonal forecast. I was looking at your I guess this is your seasonal forecast.
Yes,
for this year.
So that's just adding up the numbers. So that's we had 4, so 11 more, and then 15 total. So the forecast is for 15 named storms, 6 hurricanes, and 2 majors. We're probably gonna have a 4th hurricane today. It's tricky when you get a bunch of short-lived hurricanes like Earl. It's going to be hurricane. If Hermine becomes a hurricane, it's definitely going to be going for less than a day. Earl was a hurricane for like 12 hours before it went in.
That's funny.
The number I like to verify off of is this accumulated cyclone energy, which most people don't use because you have to you basically take the wind speeds and square them and sum them up. But it helps kind of average out, like if you have a storm like say Gaston that's been out there for 10 days, it generates a lot of ACE, but it only counts as one storm. But in terms of how much energy is generated, that's more what we're trying to predict. Then it's hard to be able to predict. If you get really short-lived, you can have a year like 2013, which had 14 storms, which is a good number of storms. It had 2 hurricanes, and they both lasted like 2 days. So, I mean, it was a really quiet season overall, but if you just look at the number of storms, that's why you try to at least get people to look at the number of hurricanes and preferably an integrated number like ACE. But obviously, general public just says, well, how many letters in the alphabet have there been,
Yeah, it's easier to take in.
And so that's the thing with like hurricanes is hurricanes, while better than named storms, you can have a lot of hurricanes and end up with not a particularly high ACE. 2012 is a good example. I think we had 12 hurricanes, but it wasn't that active. I mean, we had 2 major hurricanes, both only lasted 6 hours each. So it was an active season, but not nearly as active as you would have thought since we had 12 hurricanes.
Yeah. So this year, you guys, it looks like you're doing pretty good.
So far, we're pretty much. So I keep track of all of global tropical cyclone statistics in real time, and right now ACE is running a little bit above normal. But it's interesting if you look at what's coming up. The next 10 days, the models aren't developing really anything new. That wave coming off Africa has got a lot of dry air. It looks like it's going to be so. Potentially by the peak of the season, which is September 10th, at least at this point, if I were making a forecast, I would say probably ACE will be about normal, depending unless Hermine does something really funky and hangs around for 7 days or so.
Yeah.
But it'll probably be considered post-tropical, even if it's a low pressure. It'll be more extratropical than tropical. So we'll see what they do. They may have a case where it goes extratropical and then comes back and becomes retropical again. So that would be interesting.
Like Ivan, I think.
Yeah.
Ivan did that thing where it like looped around and then came back down. Yeah,
it would be really interesting to see if they get one of like this where it actually becomes potentially could become post-tropical and then re-intensify and become a hurricane again, which would be interesting. So we could potentially have an interesting situation, or the GFS just kind of takes it out and kills it. So we'll see. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, we'll see which model prevails, or if any of them prevail.
Yeah.
Anything else you're working on right now? Besides, I know this probably takes a lot of time, but I'm just curious.
I mean, this is the global statistics. Like for me, I like this because it's just a way to kind of, people ask, how many storms have there been? So I have a website where you can go in and see how many storms have been globally, and then you can rank them and see, okay, how many hurricanes, major hurricanes have we had? Because like if you look at a year like this year, overall ACE is just about dead on normal, but it's been very active in the Northeast Pacific, very quiet in the Northwest Pacific, and the Atlantic's been near normal so far. So it's the season as a whole for the entire northern hemisphere has been average, but it's due to compensations in various basins, and that's pretty typical. You'll get generally when the North Atlantic is active, the Pacific tends to be quiet, and vice versa. So typically, your most active global seasons, or your most active Northern Hemisphere seasons, are the quiet Atlantic seasons, because they have different relationships with El Nino. Like 2010 was super active in the Atlantic, and the East Pac and West Pac were just dead. So that's I just think it's interesting how everything kind of balances each other out.
Gotcha. Cool. So one last question we ask everyone who comes on the show: what kind of advice would you give to someone, a young researcher, someone who wants to maybe do tropical studies or anything in atmospheric science? What kind of advice would you give them?
Go to Colorado State. No,
there you go.
Seriously.
Self-promotion. I like it.
That's right. No, I was always interested in hurricanes since I was a little kid. I'd say, if you're an undergraduate or whatever, and you want to get into atmospheric science, meteorology, if you don't have a meteorology program there, do a lot of math and some physics. And but my undergraduate degree was in geography, and I had obviously a real interest in meteorology. But I had my undergrad was in geography, and I was actually Dr. Gray's undergrad major as well. So he's a fellow geographer. But when you do like what I do, when you're looking at basically kind of how patterns around the globe impact weather, it actually helps to kind of have that spatial view of things, because not everything happens in a little box. It's how things happen globally impact other things. It's amazing how, as Dr. Gray always said, the entire atmosphere and ocean function as a single unit. When you perturb one thing in one place, it changes everything everywhere else. So
yeah,
I think
that's an awesome quote.
Yeah, I think that's something he hammered into me and working with him for 15 years.
That's cool. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll be sure to have you on in the future.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Back out here now live. Thank you to Dr. Philip Klotzbach for joining us on the Weather Junkies on an admittedly busy evening in the meteorology community as Hermine bears down on the Big Bend area of Florida, but very interesting to hear from a tropical weather expert. Wouldn't you agree, Dakota?
Yeah, it was awesome sitting down with him. I felt like I was talking to a living tropical encyclopedia, because he would bring up these storms that I maybe hadn't heard of or forgotten about, and had these statistics, and it was unbelievable talking with him. And I was lucky enough that he is in our department, so I could just go on to the building next door and talk to him and have a chat with him. I actually got really lucky. I didn't realize this, but he works remotely most of the time in California, and he just happened to be here this week, and we got to talk to him. So yeah, it was a really, really good conversation, and it was a pleasure talking with him. Hopefully we can have him on again, especially since he's right nearby every now and then. So Tyler, let's wrap up the show here with kind of what you're expecting Hermine to do after it moves through Florida and along the East Coast.
This will be very cool to look back on, so let's give it a go.
Cool. Huh?
So for southern New England, I think gusty winds, but not damaging winds, rip currents, minor coastal flooding, not a whole lot of damage, but probably pictures and videos of water splashing up against immediate coastal properties, and beneficial rain, but probably not flooding in southern New England. I think there'll be periods of rain. Some areas probably get an inch, especially the farther south you head, but I really don't think it's going to be a lot of rain here in southern New England. New Jersey, on the other hand, unfortunately, I think there are going to be some pretty, I don't know if I want to say devastating, but bad images that come out of the shoreline areas. Again, not Sandy, not Irene, but I saw the beaches firsthand, how they've been built up with a lot of sand and what's that grass called? Seagrass. They look beautiful, and that was back in July. And I have a feeling a lot of that work is going to be undone with this storm. They still had barges pouring sand to build the beach out into the water. And I mean, if this storm sits out there for days, a lot of that's probably going to go away. That's my prediction. I think New Jersey is going to be hard hit.
Yeah, that is not going to be good. I hope I hope the storm somehow either stays over land or goes out to sea. I guess the best case scenario is it just kind of takes a hard right turn and goes out to sea before battering parts of the coast. Yeah, so it'll be interesting to watch. And if you live on the East Coast and you're right on the coast, make sure you're taking preparations there. Any last words, Tyler?
Stay safe and enjoy the storm.
Okie doke, there you have it. Stay safe from the storm. Thanks for listening tonight. Really appreciate you guys tuning in. If you're not following us, you can follow us on Twitter at the WX Junkies. We're also on Facebook. You can listen to this podcast on SoundCloud, YouTube, or iTunes, or your favorite podcast provider. If you're on iTunes, give us a rating or review. It just helps us get a little more attention, a little more viewers, so that we can keep making this podcast. And Tyler, who can we expect next week?
We are having a broadcaster on from Colorado Springs, Colorado, Jessica Lebel. She joined the KK TV weather team in December of 2015. She's a meteorologist. She attended University of Kansas for her atmospheric science degree. So we're excited to have her on the show. It's next week, Thursday evening, the typical time, live at 8 o'clock. Once again, Jessica Lebel joining us next Thursday. Very excited for that. We hope you enjoyed this show. For Dr. Klotzbach, Dakota, and me, thank you for listening, and we will see you right back here next week.